Everything you have to know about dangerous genetically modified foods by international best-selling author and filmmaker Jeffrey M. Smith. Mr. Smith is the executive director of the Institute for Responsible Technology and the leading spokesperson on the health dangers of genetically modified organisms. His first book, Seeds of Deception, became the world's best-selling and #1 rated book on GMOs. His second, Genetic Roulette, is the authoritative work that presents irrefutable evidence that genetically modified foods are harmful. Former UK Environment Minister Michael Meacher says the revelations in Genetic Roulette may change the global course of events this century. And he describes Jeffrey Smith as one of the great campaigners of our age. Mr. Smith has counseled world leaders from every continent and has been quoted by hundreds of media outlets, including the New York Times, Washington Post, BBC World Service, Nature, New Scientist, and Time magazine. The following keynote speech took place at the Weston A. Price Foundation Conference in November 2008.
Please join me in welcoming Jeffrey Smith.
We are all activists. How many people consider themselves foodies? Yes, yes. All right, here's a loaded question. How many people have convinced several others to change their diet? Over 50? Over 1,000? Yes. We are, the seed crystal. In nature, there's the seed crystal that changes the entire structure of the organism or organization. And I'll tell you, with the genetically engineered foods, the seed crystal is planted and it's moving. We have a phenomenal opportunity over the next 14, 15 months to kick GMOs out of the food supply. Yes, yes, absolutely, absolutely. And I know from whence I speak. Genetically engineered bovine growth hormone. Remember that? Well, it will soon be history. Yes. In March of this year, Walmart said, no more RBGH in our milk. Starbucks, Kroger's, Publix, at least 40 of the top 100 dairies so far. So what happened? The seed crystal's at work. It turns out, others call it tipping point. A small percentage of consumers changing brand choices based on information. All of a sudden, using a product becomes a marketing liability, and it moves the market. So if you look at the actual New York Times reports and the Washington Post and the Boston Globe, they talk about tipping point. They talk about explosion in the industry. How did this arise? Well, it turns out a few of us did it on purpose. It was no accident. We simply had to explain, oh yeah, that milk, the one with more pus. Oh, and more antibiotics, and more bovine growth hormone, and more IGF-1, insulin-like growth factor 1. You know, the stuff where if it's in high levels in your blood, it increases cancer and incidence of fraternal twins. Oh, that milk. You want that milk? So we started spreading it around, writing about it in books, giving PowerPoint presentations, having postcards go to different dairies, and the tipping point was reached about 2.5 years ago. Tillamook, the second largest cheese chunk producer in the United States, went RBGH free, and then it was like the domino effect, and we're still watching it. And 3 weeks ago, Monsanto finalized its sale of its bovine growth hormone to Elanco, Eli Lilly's veterinary division, because Monsanto realized the days of bovine growth hormone are over. Yeah. Let's give us all right. So we've got the formula. We know that we can convince a small percentage of consumers to change their brands, and the tipping point happens. So what about genetically engineered foods? What is going to cause Kraft or Nestle's or Hershey's to hold on to its genetically engineered corn? Very little. There's no consumer benefit. Not a single one. Not like trans fats, which gives you something, and aspartame, which theoretically gives you something and takes a lot away. There's no consumer benefit to GMOs. You can change to non-GMO without even changing the formula for your product. Just switch to the non-GM corn, the non-GM soy. So if we get about, let's say, 5% of US consumers, 15 million people, avoiding brands that contain genetically engineered foods, I think that's more than we need to get Kraft and Hershey's and Nestle's and McDonald's and others to switch to non-GM, because they'll see a reduction in their market share, they'll see a trend, and they'll simply tell their supply chain, use the non-GM varieties. You know, when the tipping point was hit in Europe in April of 1999, within 1 week, virtually the entire food supply in Europe, all the major manufacturers committed to remove GM ingredients for Europe. But those same companies feed us GMOs because in the United States we haven't hit the tipping point. And part of the reason we haven't hit the tipping point is that people don't really understand what products are GM, what products are genetically modified. There's no labeling here. And CBS New York Times poll this year said that if GMOs were labeled, 53% of Americans would not eat them. If 1 in 10 of those, if 9 out of 10 of those people were lying, it's still enough to hit the tipping point. So we just need to give the information about which products are GM and which products are non-GM. And add a little bit of motivation by describing how eating a genetically engineered corn chip might turn your intestinal flora into living pesticide factories. So we've created the Campaign for Healthier Eating in America, whose slogan is, healthy eating starts with no GMOs. So all you foodies out there, this is your mantra this year coming. So you have all these things to give to all of your friends and your devotees and your patients. And you want to talk about raw milk and you want to talk about soy. But healthy eating starts with no GMOs. Because by the end of next year, we expect to hit the tipping point. And we're going to do it here. Now, we have created non-GMO education centers, and on the top of that are non-GMO shopping guides, which list the brands that are non-GM and list samples of products that are GM, and also describes how you can evaluate a product by reading the ingredients and looking at the packaging to determine if it's GM or not. So we are giving, we're not waiting for the government to label, we'll do it ourselves. And we're going to put these non-GMO, we are already putting these non-GMO education centers in natural food stores around the country. If you meet me after the talk over there, you all get your free non-GMO shopping guide. You all get your health risks brochure, which encourages you to use the shopping guide. For those of you that are doctors, we have a package for your patients. And we're putting it out through many different organizations in electronic form, in physical form. We expect to distribute the shopping guide totally in the tens of millions next year. So we are going to do what people have been we've been whining about this for 12 years, waiting for the government to do it for us. What a waste of life. What a waste of life. Obama says he's going to label genetically engineered foods. He says that. Let's hear it. Yeah. I'm not going to wait, though. How do we avoid GMOs? 4 ways. By organic, by products that say non-GMO, by products listed on a non-GMO shopping guide, or avoid the at-risk ingredients. Now, what are the at-risk ingredients? For the crops, there are 4 major GM crops: soy, corn, cotton, and canola. Soy, corn, cotton, and canola. Everyone, soy, corn, cotton, and canola. Now, what are vegetable oils made out of generally? Soy, corn, cotton, and canola. Another excuse to avoid vegetable oils. Okay, minor food crops. Hawaiian papaya, zucchini, crookneck squash, a tiny percentage of the GM crops out there, and also, unfortunately, starting this year, the sugar supply in the United States will be genetically engineered from sugar beets. So this is the first new crop introduced in a long time, so we have to move quickly. We don't have time to waste. Okay, everyone raise your hand. Everyone raise your hand. Thank you all for volunteering to do more on the GMO issue, and you will know how to do it within an hour, and it'll be easy and fun and successful. Remember RBGH? Well, your children won't. All right. So the reason we're here is due to the glories of the Food and Drug Administration. Based on a single sentence, GMOs have flooded the market. The sentence in the policy says the agency is not aware of any information showing that the foods created by these new methods differ from other foods in any meaningful or uniform way. Now, it's obviously not true. In fact, documents made public from a lawsuit proved that that sentence was a lie. But on the basis of that sentence, the FDA said no testing was necessary. The FDA said if the companies that produce the biotech foods believe they are safe, I guess it's coming, they can put it on the market without even telling the FDA. But a friend of mine sued the FDA, 44,000 internal memos became public, and it turned out that the overwhelming consensus among the FDA's own scientists were that GMOs might create allergies, toxins, new diseases, and nutritional problems. They had urged their superiors to require long-term studies. But every time the policy came back, the new draft of the policy, the concerns of the scientists were systematically extracted and removed and ignored. One scientist wrote in a memo, "What's become of this document? It's basically a political document. There's no science in it. It does not address the unpredicted side effects." So who overruled the scientists? The person in charge of policy at the FDA, Michael Taylor, Monsanto's former attorney, and later Monsanto's vice president. He had worked with Monsanto and a group of biotech companies before working at the FDA to create the ideal regulatory system for the companies, and then evidently implemented it himself. This was in 1992, and his policy still stands. So the companies do participate in a voluntary consultation process, technically called a meaningless exercise, where they bring their conclusions, not the raw feeding study data, not real science, their conclusions, and the FDA responds with a letter which says, "You believe your foods are safe." It never says the FDA says the foods are safe. It says, "You understand it's your responsibility to evaluate your foods, and we understand that you've evaluated them as safe." No further questions. And that is our glorious assessment system of genetically engineered foods. Now, one food, one GM food, the Flavor Saver tomato, was the only genetically engineered crop, the first one, to ever go through a thorough, systematic feeding study that was turned over to the FDA. They did a rat study with the tomato, and the rats refused to eat the tomato. If you ever want to market rat-proof tomatoes, you know where to go. It turns out farmers and scientists and reporters from all over North America say that when given a choice, many animals chose to avoid eating GMOs. Pigs, cows, geese, elk, squirrels, deer, raccoons, mice, and rats. In fact, in my book, Seeds of Deception, before each chapter, I write a little vignette, The Wisdom of the Animals, with another description. And someone evidently read that about squirrels, where they put corn on the cob out for squirrels, and the squirrels wouldn't eat the BT corn. So he wanted to do this experiment and see if it worked for the squirrels around his house. So he bought a couple of bags of corn, BT corn that produces its own pesticide, and natural corn. And he put it in the garage, waiting for the winter to feed the squirrels. And he forgot. And in the spring, he discovered the bags, and the mice had done the experiment for him. The mice had broken into the non-GM corn and finished every kernel and never touched the BT corn. So it's our job to get humans up to the level of animals. Are you up for it? Yeah? Now, they force-fed the rats, and 7 of 20 developed stomach lesions, and 7 of 40 died within 2 weeks. Now, in the UK, they decided, let's do long-term feeding studies and prove to the skeptical public that GMOs were safe. So they put out a request for a proposal to create the testing protocol. They got 28 different applications, and they gave the $3 million grant to Dr. Arpad Pusztai, the world's leading expert in his field. How many people have heard of Dr. Arpad Pusztai? All right. So I write all about him in the first chapter of my book. Someone did a master's thesis on the impact of my book on the passage of the first state regulation on GMOs. It was in Vermont. And he interviewed a bunch of representatives, and they said normally books don't influence policymakers because they're too thick, we don't have time. But when I started reading it, I couldn't put it down, and someone said the book spread like wildfire and was the basis for every conversation on GMOs in the State House once it arrived. So here's the first activist tip. If you choose to use this in your lending library, then what you say is, just read the first chapter. And that's usually all it needs. And that first chapter is a kind of a microcosm, as we'll see in a minute, of what's going on with GMOs. Because Dr. Pusztai, he worked with a team from 3 different institutes, including his own very prestigious institute, 20 or 30 scientists, and he created a protocol that was going to be used as the EU testing protocol for GMOs. And what he did was, he created a potato engineered to produce an insecticide. Took a gene from a snowdrop plant, put it into the potato, and as part of the protocol, they fed it to rats along with a complete and balanced diet. Another group of rats were fed natural potatoes, and a third group were fed natural potatoes spiked with the same insecticide that the genetically engineered potatoes were producing. So GM potatoes with the insecticide. Only the GM group got sick. What was the cause of the problem? What caused the potentially precancerous cell growth in the digestive tract, the smaller brains, livers, and testicles, the atrophy of the liver, and the damaged immune system? What caused the intestinal walls on the rats, on the right side of the photo, to have such prolific cell growth? Or the stomach lining to look about double the size? It was not the insecticide. It was somehow the process of genetically engineering the potato. Now, Dr. Pusztai went public with his concerns, was a hero for about 2 days at his prestigious institute, and then 2 phone calls were allegedly placed from the UK Prime Minister's office to the director of the institute. The next day, Dr. Pusztai was fired from his job after 35 years, silenced with threats of a lawsuit. His 20-member research team was disbanded. They never implemented the long-term safety testing protocols. Instead, they mounted a campaign to trash his reputation. He's since got the data back. It's published in The Lancet. And it implicates the process of genetic engineering as very dangerous. These problems occurred in 10 days. Now, one thing that was interesting about the potatoes was that they would have passed the assessments used around the world, even where they're required in the EU. The assessments done by industry are so poor, so superficial, that the potatoes would have made it to market. But the crops that are already on the market have never been tested in the ways for these things that the potatoes were tested for. So they may be creating the same problems because they were created from the same process. So this is the first possible cause of problems. The very process itself of genetically engineering a crop causes massive collateral damage and unpredicted side effects. So what is the process? Let's say you want to take corn and turn it into a registered pesticide. So you take a gene from soil bacterium called Bacillus thuringiensis, or BT. How many people use BT on their garden or farm? It's used by organic gardeners. It's a natural pesticide. But they take the gene out of that pesticide, they make changes in it so that it'll work in crops. But they have to figure out a way to turn it on, because normally genes are self-regulating based on the needs of the cell. But they're ignoring the needs of the cell, so they put in a viral promoter, an on switch, that turns on that gene 24/7 around the clock to pump out that BT toxin. They put an end switch at the very end, stop signal, saying to the cell, stop reading, the gene ends here. Then they make millions of copies of that gene construct and put it into a gun. And they shoot that gun into millions of cells, hoping that some of the genes make it into the DNA of some of those cells. You can't tell where it ends up. You can't even tell by looking at it if it got in there. So they need to figure out a way to figure out which one of the cells have the genes functioning. So before they make millions of copies, they add another gene into the gene construct. It's called an antibiotic-resistant marker gene. Its job is to produce a protein that renders the cell invincible to a normally deadly antibiotic. So after they shoot the genes into the cell, they add antibiotics, killing almost all of the cells except the very few that have the gene construct functioning inside the DNA, because that has rendered the cell invincible to that antibiotic. Then they take those cells and they clone them into the corn plant that produces the BT toxin. So it's a lot of things, but it's not natural. It's not sex. And what it does is it causes unexpected changes in the DNA. 2 to 4% of the DNA is different as a result of the process of insertion and the cloning. And most of that is mutations. Hundreds or thousands of mutations up and down the DNA. Genes can also be deleted, permanently turned off, permanently turned on. And on top of that, the single insertion causes a holistic response where as much as 5% of the genes, the natural functioning genes in the plant, change. They change the levels of expression of the proteins they're producing. So we're talking about massive collateral damage. When you change the DNA, you change the RNA, which the DNA creates, you change the proteins interact to create all these natural compounds which give the special qualities to a plant. Many of them can be increased, decreased, there could be new ones. And we don't test for them. They don't test for them. They test for a small handful of known nutrients, maybe 1 or 2 known toxins, and put it on the market, knowing that there may be hundreds of different compounds that have changed levels of expression or are new. So one example that was found accidentally was that soy and corn have higher levels of lignin after being genetically engineered. It's the woody component in trees and plants. But the metabolic pathway that produces lignin produces rotenone also, which is a known plant pesticide, which may be a cause of Parkinson's disease. So if it creates more lignin, it might create more rotenone, it might create more Parkinson's disease, but we don't know it. It's just one of a myriad of things that can change as a result of the process. It is a genetic roulette. The second cause of problems is that the protein that they intend to be produced in the plant, what happens is, just to review the basic science, they put a gene into the plant so that the gene produces a protein, and the protein has a trait that they consider desirable. So that protein may be harmful. Now there are two primary traits. About 80% of all crops are designed not to die when sprayed with a particular herbicide. So here's how that worked. Monsanto found bacteria surviving in a chemical waste dump in the presence of the normally deadly Roundup, their herbicide. And they said, let's put it in the food supply. So they took the gene that produced the Roundup-ready protein, allowing the bacteria to survive, and they put that gene into soy, corn, cotton, canola, and now sugar beets, so that when you spray the field with Roundup, you just kill all the other plant biodiversity in the field, not the Roundup-ready crops. About the other 20% of the crops produce their own pesticide, Bt. Then there's a tiny percentage, those papaya, zucchini, and crookneck squash, that have virus-resistant proteins. Now, viral proteins, it turns out, there's more than 100 studies that show that viral proteins can suppress the defense mechanism against viral infection. And they may also be toxic, interfering with things like the cell cycle, which might be cancerous. So the protein itself that's intended to be put into the product, in the case of these papaya, zucchini, and crookneck squash, might theoretically be causing us to be more susceptible to viral infection and cancer or other diseases. Thank you very much.
Everything you have to know about dangerous genetically modified foods by international best-selling author and filmmaker Jeffrey M. Smith. Mr. Smith is the executive director of the Institute for Responsible Technology and the leading spokesperson on the health dangers of genetically modified organisms. His first book, Seeds of Deception, became the world's best-selling and #1 rated book on GMOs. His second, Genetic Roulette, is the authoritative work that presents irrefutable evidence that genetically modified foods are harmful.
Thank you very much.